Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing the Sharks lineup from yesterday's preseason game against the Anaheim Ducks. As I had said going into that preseason game, that the Sharks were likely going to run a lineup that was pretty close to what they plan on starting the season with. And besides a couple of players who I suspect to end up being subbed out, this is pretty much a lineup that we can expect the Sharks to have for opening night in just under a couple of weeks. And while I was unable to watch this preseason game yesterday against the Anaheim Ducks, because apparently we don't even care about broadcasting preseason games, I can comment on how these lineups actually ended up shaping up to be compared to my predictions from a video about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, where I thought the lines would end up. So here on the first line, it is the duo of Couture and Meier along with Dahlin, newcomer here for the San Jose Sharks. Definitely an interesting line, one that I didn't necessarily think that would happen. I thought in the end Couture would end up being with LeBanc most likely, as well as potentially with Meier, potentially with someone like Rudolfs Balcers as well. But here Dahlin is given the opportunity, and this is mostly because LeBanc actually was not in the lineup here tonight. And this is where a couple of those changes that I talked about a bit earlier would likely come in. LeBanc, I feel as though, was likely benched for this game just because of his poor performance in the previous preseason game back on Friday. I think Booner was maybe punishing him a bit, where it's essentially a situation of, if you're not going to play well, we actually have some players who can step into the lineup and do a pretty decent job of replacing you. So while I think still LeBanc will be in the lineup for starting night, this is definitely a bit of a wake-up call for him. I don't know if LeBanc will immediately take a spot onto this first line, or if maybe he'll end up onto the third line when it comes to opening night, but it's interesting that Dahlin was given a trial here on this first line. When it comes to Couture being with Meier, I also thought that was interesting because in my prediction video, I thought Meier would end up on a line with Hertl and Barabanov. But as we move on to the second line here, we see that it is William Eklund filling in the spot of Evander Kane on that Hertl-Barabanov line. Obviously, that was a lineup with Evander Kane that worked so well at the end of last season. And so I thought Meier, since he is a somewhat similar player to Evander Kane, would be the player who would be thrust into that left wing spot. But instead, Eklund is put in, which gives this line an extremely different feel. Eklund and Evander Kane, besides both being forwards, are pretty much night and day in terms of their different type of play styles. I mean, just at a very base level, Evander Kane is much more of a goal scorer, while William Eklund, just in the very brief time that we've seen him, shows himself to be much more of a playmaker than a scorer. He definitely seems to be a bit of a pass-first type of player. So it does give a very different feel to this line, but it'll definitely be very interesting to see Hertl now, especially with Evander Kane potentially not being in the lineup for the San Jose Sharks. Hertl likely takes up the mantle as the best player on this team, and him getting matched up with the Sharks' best prospect in William Eklund in this wild card like Barabanov, who was so impressive near the end of last season and we hope will continue to be impressive this season. This is definitely going to be probably the most interesting line to watch for the San Jose Sharks if indeed it does stay together for opening night. Moving on to the third line, no surprise that Nick Benino is centering it. He's with Rudolfs Balcers, who, as I said, I thought might be on that first line, but on the third line was definitely a second option for him. And on his wing as well is actually Lane Peterson, and this is a good sign for Peterson. Obviously, he had been competing for the fourth line center role, and in the end, and I'll get to this a bit later, it is Jasper Weatherby who seems to be claiming that spot, but Peterson was so impressive otherwise through training camp that he actually was moved further up in the lineup and playing in an off position here as a third line winger, and that is very good for him. He was very impressive in that previous preseason game against the Anaheim Ducks. Obviously, I didn't get to watch him last night, so I can't really tell you if he will retain this spot. This is also one of the positions that I can definitely see changing from opening night. For instance, a very easy change for the Sharks to make would be to just put LeBanc in place of Lane Peterson and keep everything else the same here for these forwards for that opening night. So that's a possibility if Peterson wasn't actually good this past night, but it's still a good sign that he actually managed to move out of his fourth line center position and up into the lineup. It shows that Bob Booner has been impressed with his performance thus far. And finally, the fourth line. This is a fourth line that actually stayed the same from that Friday preseason game, which is actually rather impressive and says a lot about these three players, Weatherby, Viel, and Adam Raska. I had pointed out in that previous video that I didn't think Raska would end up being able to make the team this season. I thought he was very, very close, but he'd end up waiting until next season really to be able to start and play a consistent role for the San Jose Sharks. But the team really does like him, and honestly, I cannot blame them for that. Adam Raska at this point seems more or less destined to at the very least be on the team come opening night. He's a very, very solid fourth line player. Jasper Weatherby is another player just like that, and obviously I expected Weatherby to make the lineup just because of how impressive he had been earlier on in training camp. And so this is going to make up a very interesting duo on the fourth line, Weatherby and Raska. When it comes to Viel, he's definitely a player who I can end up seeing get swapped out a bit. He could also be a potential lineup change for starting night. You know, a player like Andrew Cogliano could step into this role. A player like Matt Nieto could step into this role. So Viel definitely, you know, a player who could get swapped out, but if the Sharks are looking for a fighting presence, as we know, he's definitely been getting into fights this preseason, and Viel can be an option for that. And at the very least, as I've said multiple times about Viel, at least he's not Curtis Gabriel. Moving on to the defense, which is pretty interesting, I guess you could say, as I pointed out earlier, this is a lineup that seems as though the Sharks aren't going to be changing too much of going into that opening night. So at the top here, we of course have the Ferraro-Burns pair. No surprise that these two players play together, but when we get to this next pair, it is Karlsson and Jacob Middleton. Now, one thing that should be noted is the fact that the reason Nikolai Knyzhov is not playing in this game is not because he's at a risk of not being able to play in the opening night lineup because of something he did poorly in training camp, but it is instead because he has been injured, and so Middleton is being trialed here with Erik Karlsson because Middleton is seemingly in line to be the Sharks' 7th defenseman for this upcoming season. So it was something that I had tweeted out just yesterday where I talked about I felt as though Ryan Merkley should get one more look and that Middleton could end up just getting benched, because at this point we've seen enough from Jacob Middleton. We know what we're going to get from him, and it's likely that he would end up being the 7th defenseman to step in for a game here or there if a player is forced to sit out for like a game, right? As long as it's not a huge long-term type of injury, Middleton was decent enough to be able to step into that role and play like 9 minutes in a particular night. But I felt as though Merkley could still be trialing for a potential long-term spot in the lineup, potentially as that 6th defenseman, but instead they did not want to give him that extra look. And today, just a couple of hours ago, around that time, Ryan Merkley was actually sent down to the San Jose Barracuda. So that is the end of the Ryan Merkley experiment here in this preseason. I would have liked, as I said, to have seen one more game from him because he was just so impressive in that previous game on Friday against the Anaheim Ducks. But alas, that's not going to happen. Ryan Merkley will likely get a very expanded role at the AHL level with the Barracuda, and hopefully he can sort of thrive in that role. Hopefully he puts in that effort, the coin flip lands on heads multiple times, and that he can be able to make the team for the 22-23 season. Moving on to the third pairing, we have Vlasic and Santeri Hataka, who continues to challenge for a spot in this lineup. Prior to the start of the preseason, I had given him as a potential outside option to be able to replace Radim Shemek on the third defensive pairing with Marc-Edouard Vlasic, but I'd said it was relatively unlikely because of the fact that Hataka actually plays in a very similar way to Radim Shemek, and so Hataka would actually have to completely outmatch Shemek in terms of defensive capabilities compared to the options of Merkley and Knyazov, who I had said just offer a different style, so it would just be a stylistic route that Bob Booner would want to take. But it seems as though after the performance of Radim Shemek in that previous preseason game on Friday, that Bob Booner wanted to give a chance for Santeri Hataka to sort of grasp this 6th defenseman spot. So it'll be very interesting to watch moving on into the final preseason game coming up on Saturday against the Vegas Golden Knights, and then moving a week later into the opening night game, whether or not Hataka will find himself in the lineup or if Šimek will have done enough to hold on to his lineup spot. And I think it'll be very telling to about it with who gets the actual game on the final preseason game of this preseason, just because I think if Šimek gets that game, it would be unlikely to then just go back to Hataka unless Šimek does really bad in that one, and the same thing would be if Hataka gets that game. So that will be one thing to keep an eye on for that game. And finally, in nets, we have James Reimer once again. This is mostly because Adin Hill actually ended up getting what is supposed to be a minor injury to, I think, his arm or his shoulder, and it ended up keeping him out of the lineup for this past game. He was supposed to play not just this past game, but also the final preseason game on Saturday against the Golden Knights. Hopefully he will be completely healthy by then. It would definitely be beneficial for the Sharks to get Adin Hill that one more game start prior to the actual start of the season, because it seems as though that Adin Hill is the goaltender that the Sharks are leaning more towards for being the starter here. But James Reimer certainly hasn't been bad during this preseason. The Sharks actually ended up losing this past preseason game to the Anaheim Ducks 3-2 in shootout. And while I didn't actually see Reimer's performance, the fact that he only let in 2 goals through regulation and then the shootout doesn't particularly count for much of anything is, I guess, a decent sign that the Sharks shouldn't be getting bad goaltending even if Adin Hill isn't ready for the season start, if Reimer is between the pipes. But that will do it for this lineup review. As I said, there will likely only be a couple of changes here or there, maybe LeBanc drawing into the lineup, maybe Matt Nieto drawing into the lineup, and then of course the situation between Hataka and Šimek. It'll definitely be a very interesting last preseason game and into the start of the regular season. Class dismissed.